And from the national headquarters of RT America here in our nation's capital, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. There is an international brouhaha underway tonight between the United States and China. It was no doubt started by the Trump administration's trade war, which the Chinese say is nothing more than an economic attack against them. But if Mr. Trump started it, then it's the NBA, yes, the National Basketball Association, that has continued it and fired off a volley that has the Chinese really ticked off tonight. Really ticked off. Hong Kong is a real sore spot for China, as you probably know if you've watched our newscast on a regular basis. It's a very complicated and very sensitive issue for them. So when the general manager of the Houston Rockets puts out a tweet asking people to support the Hong Kong protesters, to the Chinese, that comes off as a message that is hatefully anti-China. That's how they see it. By the way, not to get too Shakespearean here, but you know why this comment may be the unkindest cut of all? It's simple. The Chinese generally love the Houston Rockets, the basketball team, because that's where they faithfully watched Yao Ming become a worldwide superstar basketball player. But what I want to do for you tonight is try and help you better understand this story by providing you with something that you're not going to get on CNN, you're not going to get on Fox News, you're not going to get on MSNBC, where I just happened to be watching television throughout the day and saw reports on the part of all three of them, and the New York Times to boot, that were just completely one-sided. Only one side of the story. So you know what I'm going to do? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to analyze for you what Mr. Morey, that's the general manager's name from the Houston Rockets, what Mr. Morey tweeted to measure its validity and its accuracy. Remember, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, right? Nobody's saying he doesn't have a right to have an opinion. He should have an opinion. But you know what you're not entitled to? You're not entitled to your own facts. Right? Not entitled to your own facts. So what he's implying in his tweet that has, sent shockwaves around the world is that you and I, we Americans, should support the protesters because they deserve more freedom. The type of freedom that we here in the United States are blessed with. Okay? Let's look at that. Allow me to direct your attention to the Human Freedom Index, which is put out by the Cato Institute, conservative and highly respected, right? Okay, let's examine two measurements that they did. First, human freedom. The study examines all the countries in the world and rates them. On the subject of human freedom, it finds that Hong Kong is the third most free country to live in the entire world. By the way, you should know, the United States, our country, comes in at 17. All right, let's look at something else. Let's look at economic freedom. The U.S. comes in 6. Not bad, huh? Now guess where Hong Kong comes in? First, they're number 1, the most free. That, my friends, is context. And this is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it's time to do news again. All right, here's a list of the questions that you're going to be asking tomorrow. Just how fed up is China to be so insulted by a tweet? Is the UK interfering in Hong Kong because they just can't let it go? What's next for Syria, the day after Erdogan and Trump had their deal? Okay, but let's kick things off with the A block as we usually do. A look at this remarkable squaring off, if you will, between China and the NBA. Why are they so hurt? Why are the Chinese so angry over something that most Americans probably are going to look at and say, what's the big deal here, right? And then there's a question of who really stands to lose on this issue, and by how much. Few people have a better feel for this story than Christy I. She's a U.S. businesswoman who was raised in the United States but emigrated from Shanghai with her parents. She's also the host of Boom Bust, we're proud to say, seen here daily on RT America. You know, Christy, I think where we need to start with this story is you are uniquely qualified to help us understand the Chinese perspective on this, because a lot of Americans are looking at this story and saying, oh my God, why are those Chinese people so upset about this?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think what they don't understand is they never got the full context or the history of China, which is something that the NBA Brooklyn Nets owner Cai Tongxing actually came out to address as well. He actually said that the reason why this is offensive to 1.4 billion Chinese people is because you are supporting a separatist movement. And this is highly offensive to all of China, and especially China's fundamental principle of being one China, two policy. It completely attempts to undermine it. And when it comes to China, there is absolutely no room for bargaining when it comes to their national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So to them, somebody in the United States, be it an NBA official or a politician or a media figure, literally coming out and supporting what Hong Kong is doing or what the protesters doing would be, I guess, akin to somebody in China supporting California wanting to leave the United States.
Exactly. When China doesn't have as good of a grasp of America and their history and why or how California wants to leave, how much money California generates, like, China has no idea. It's not fundamentally rooted in their conscience. So being an American, like, you have an entirely different view of what these protests represent, because in China these are actually riots, and essentially, like, that's what these protests are. These protests have what started out as peaceful protesting now have essentially turned into violent riots.
In fact, there was a report just 2 weeks ago that I read in the New York Times, which is no friend of China, by the way, where what they said was that about 90% of the people in mainland China are angry at the protesters in Hong Kong. So it's much more complicated than the way it's been presented, as I alluded to a little while ago. Let's move on to the issue of the economic impact. What might it be? And I understand boycotts are already underway.
Absolutely. So there are many companies who are vulnerable to this. Nike in particular, as Nike has relied on China for double-digit growth for the last 5 years. China has been Nike's biggest emerging growing market. And because of this, now a lot of people are being like, why should we buy Nike products when Nike is so closely affiliated with the NBA? We should just support domestic brands such as Li Ning, or even outside of China, Adidas. Li Ning has officially pulled out their sponsorship for the Houston Rockets, and now we all see that across the board. You have Shanghai Pudong Industrial Bank, you have Li Ning, you have Slam Dunk Magazine, you have Tencent Streaming saying that we're going to stop streaming all of the NBA's games. So you have this entire boycott around the NBA, which currently derives 10 to 15% of their revenues from these sponsors alone.
10 to 15% of their
comes from sponsors.
So we're talking billions and billions of dollars that just went out the back door.
Exactly. This includes merchandising, licensing, streaming, broadcasting, play rights, etc.
It's all from one tweet.
Exactly. And you even have Alibaba, the Amazon of China, literally pulling out all of NBA products and even Rockets keywords. You can't even put that in a search bar right now for online consumer shopping.
You know what? It seems to me that this seems to be as much about respect as anything else.
Exactly.
It's personal.
Exactly. It's very personal. And that's what Yang Yi really tried to emphasize. He said that 你不能吃中国还骂中国, which essentially means you can't profit off of China and continue to criticize, offend, and degrade and condemn China.
Speaking of those terms that you just used, I get the feeling, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong, that had it not been for the embarrassing arrest of Huawei's founder's daughter in Toronto, essentially orchestrated by the United States, the Trump administration, and the State Department, had it not been for the tariffs, had it not been for this trade war that's going on right now, China may have been upset about this, but may not have taken it to the nth degree as they seem to be doing. Am I wrong?
Not at all. Completely correct. They would not have had this entire blackout because this is very profitable for China too. China wants to support basketball. 500 million viewers want to watch basketball and be supportive of these teams. It's a growing sport in China, and China wants to be supportive of that. But if they have this clash with the NBA, if the NBA disrespects China and their one China policy, they have no other choice.
So you add this this to the fact that they're still at war with the United States, and they're essentially digging their heels in and saying, look, we're tired of being offended. We're tired of being called cheaters. We're tired of all these things that have been said. True or not, we're tired of the offenses. And this may be their place to put their stake in the ground, as the metaphor says, right?
Exactly, because as in China, just like in America, most consumers aren't even aware of the trade war. They don't know the details of it, and because that only affects businesses. To consumers, tariffs are annoying. It makes products a little bit more expensive, but they didn't pay attention too much to it. But now when you put basketball, entertainment, you invite the consumers and the masses to all join in on the conversation. Now
maybe they'll understand, although I mentioned in the top of this story, and I don't know if you heard me, but the MSNBCs of the world, the Foxes of the world, the New York Times of the world, the CNNs of the world, they totally don't give context to this story. They don't do what you and I are doing. They just say essentially, China bad, U.S. good. There's more to it than that, isn't there?
Absolutely. There's the historical portion of it. China endured their years of humiliation, what they call the years of humiliation under America rule. And so now MSNBC, CNN, they were saying that Americans should not kowtow to China. That isn't really fair when you think of what happened to China back then. There was the years of humiliation to America as well. And this is not kowtowing, it's simply showing respect.
It's two sides to every story, and unfortunately on many U.S. affiliates and networks and newspapers, you only get the one side. I'm glad we got you, Christy. That's great. Fantastic explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Hong Kong protests are now entering their 30th week. And fitting with the theme of putting things into context, as we often do, we should remind you that Hong Kong used to be a colony of the United Kingdom. And many experts still suspect that the Brits were never exactly keen, even to this day, with the notion of just giving their land, quote unquote, back to China. Might that have something to do with the Hong Kong protests? Joining us now to talk about Hong Kong is George Galloway. George, there's something interesting about this situation because these protesters at first did have a viable complaint. That complaint seems to have been met, but yet they're still protesting. And in fact, getting increasingly aggressive in their protests. What's going on here?
It's not really protesting anymore, Rick. It's an outright challenge to the existence of the state that they are in. The violence is becoming uncontrollable. I mean, policemen are being lynched, flamethrowers, Molotovs, guns, spikes, knives, everything is being used down on the street of Hong Kong. And it's frankly a miracle. I know people don't like to talk well of China in your country, but it's frankly a miracle, the forbearance which the security forces in Hong Kong have shown. Nothing like what happens to protesters on the streets of Paris, I can tell you, or would happen on the streets of London or anywhere else, because there's protesting and there is a civil war, and we now are on the brink of civil war type conditions in Hong Kong. And it's widely felt in China, I think with some justification, that whatever the cause these protesters had in the first place, this whole thing has been hijacked by foreign interests who wish China ill.
You really believe that this is being orchestrated then by the either U.S. State Department or perhaps some other nefarious forces in maybe your own country?
Indeed, the British state has never really accepted that Hong Kong was no longer anything to do with them. Britain has exactly the same relationship to Hong Kong now as Slovakia or Romania does, but we don't act like that. And our diplomatic facility in Hong Kong doesn't look like that. And the number of intelligence men we've got on the ground doesn't look like that either. But I'm not saying that the protesters don't have a cause. They did have a very specific cause, which, as you said, has been met. They have a wider cause that they don't actually want to be part of China. But there's really not that much that they can do about that. But I believe this is in the same spectrum of hostility against China, which stretches from the demigod Dalai Lama, beloved of your Hollywood personalities, right across the Falun Gong, organ transplants, the Muslim question in Xinjiang, and now Hong Kong. It's all an attempt to slow China's progress. My kid, my youngest kid, goes 5 days a week to a Chinese nursery school. Why? Because when she grows up, China is going to be the most important country in the world. And a lot of people just don't like to hear that, Rick.
Especially if they live in Hong Kong, where they used to make up for 48% of the GDP of all of China, and today they make up less than 2% of the GDP of China. They live in a place that used to be, well, listen, if you lived in Hong Kong, you were living the good life, perhaps some of the best, status of living anywhere in the world. Today, the people of China, the mainland, have seen their situation increase economically, while the people of Hong Kong have not. So this is really about economics again, isn't it?
I think so, but there's also a kind of ethnic, racial element to it. For some bizarre reason, there seem to be a lot of Hong Kong people who think they're not Chinese, even though to the rest of the world they, of course, are. But they look down on some of the other Chinese, including other Chinese in Hong Kong. So it is a bit of a mix, but you're right. Hong Kong was once extremely important to China's economy. Now it's hardly important at all. And that's because not that Hong Kong has sunk, but the rest of China has risen. And in this 70th anniversary, it's possible to glimpse, as I say, in our lifetime, easily, that China will be the richest and most powerful, most important country in the world. Imagine how that feels in London and Washington.
Sounds like a bitter pill for a lot of people all over the world, and especially the people right now in Hong Kong, which may explain, perhaps as well as any other argument, why they're out on the streets and why they're so aggressively protesting. George Galloway, as usual, my pleasure, sir, for spending some time with you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Thanks. Turkey began their assault on the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in Syria yesterday, prompting criticism from pretty much everybody except Turkey and President Trump, who agreed to pull U.S. troops out of the region to allow for this attack, and is now getting blasted for it by the mainstream media, by Democrats, but especially by Republicans, by fellow Republicans, which is kind of interesting. This is a story with a lot of puffery and even some demagoguery. Putting it all together for us tonight is RT correspondent Rachel Blevins.
Turkey has confirmed that it launched airstrikes targeting the border between Syria and Iraq ahead of a planned offensive in northeastern Syria. A Turkish security official said the goal was to cut off a transportation route between Iraq and Syria that is used by Kurdish forces, as Turkey confirms it is ready to begin the operation in Syria. While Turkey claims it plans to create a safe zone for more than 1 million Syrian refugees to return to their country, the region Turkey is targeting is currently controlled by the Kurds, a group Turkey has classified as a terrorist organization. Now, in response to criticism that the U.S. is leaving the Kurds to be massacred by Turkey after they have been a strong ally in the fight against ISIS, President Trump argued that this is part of his overall plan to get out of Syria.
Going to do this 9 months ago, and we were not at 100%, but we were pretty close. Everyone said, can we get to 100%? Now I get to 100%. And they say, well, maybe we could stay longer. I say, well, when do we get out?
But while the U.S. is pulling forces back from the border in Syria, they are not withdrawing troops altogether. And retired Army Major Richard Ojeda told RT America that he believes the U.S. should be operating with a better plan if it wants to end this war.
We do need to end these forever wars, but there's a proper way of doing that. It's not just all of a sudden everybody turning and running away from the battlefield. You know, you have to do it there's a process so that you don't leave people that are your allies up there, you know, to fend for themselves.
But former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras said he believes Trump is meeting resistance from both sides of the aisle because the political establishment wants to keep the U.S. military in Syria to maintain control.
And it has nothing to do with defeating ISIS and really has nothing to do with Kurds. It has to do with blocking the Russians and the Iranians and making sure that the people keep dying in Syria so we can still keep pressing the Assad government.
In response to Turkey's looming plans to launch a military offensive in Syria, representatives from both Russia and Iran have urged Turkey to respect the territorial integrity and national sovereignty in Syria. And a spokesperson for President Putin maintained that all foreign troops illegally present in Syria must leave the country, which would include the United States. In Washington, Rachel Blevins, RT.
Let's dig deeper into this issue. Joining us now, former Naval Intelligence Officer John Jordan. John, I'm going to read from my notes. I'm kind of put together a couple of notes here on everything that I've been reading in the, I guess, mainstream media, for lack of a better term, that's being reported that will likely happen or could happen as a result of this decision that's been made in Syria. A, the Kurds could be completely wiped out, or they could run to Bashar Assad, or they could end up looking for the protection of the Russians, emboldening the Russians. It will leave prisoners unguarded, and it could even lead to a stronger Islamic State. How many of those things, if any, do you think possible or plausible?
All of them with one exception, Rick. I don't think that the Turks are going to push so hard in there and launch the military effort necessary to, wipe out the Kurds. They're going to push them back. They're going to push them back away from Turkey's border. Turkey doesn't need that kind of PR disaster and humanitarian mess on its hands. But all of the other options or any combination thereof are very, very possible. The United States has dealt itself out of Syria in terms of having a viable military options to affect political outcomes. America's only leverage now really is in the economic realm in terms of sanctions on Syria or, support for Israel in terms of continued strikes on Iranian positions in Syria. So America is militarily out, but diplomatically and economically still in the game there.
What do you make of the arguments that are being made that say that by doing this, we're essentially sending signals to the world that we are not going to stand behind our allies and that we are abandoning somebody who really was there for us when we needed them? How do you respond to that?
That's a great question, Rick. That is the real damage. That is the real risk undertaken by the Trump administration in this case. The Kurds have fought alongside the U.S. In Iraq and in Syria for a long time. The YPG, the Kurdish organization, has been an ally of ours. And if just the appearance of them being abandoned is going to shake other American allies and other groups and countries that perhaps would ally themselves to the United States, if the United States ends up being perceived as an unreliable ally, and if in fact large numbers of Kurds are killed and the U.S. sits back and does nothing, that would have a chilling effect on America's ability to influence and make friends in the region.
Then there's the argument that was presented first yesterday by Newsweek magazine and then by many others that President Trump allowed himself to get owned by Erdogan. Is that true? Do you think that President Trump in this case perhaps became weak in his position and he let Erdogan become the strong man here?
No, I mean, Newsweek is clearly part of the mainstream media and will say or do anything it can to attack President Trump, even if it means ignoring an issue which is far more complex. In this case, Erdogan is insisting on the 30-kilometer buffer zone inside of Syria, while the United States had agreed to 14 kilometers. Erdogan is going to get that, but there's a side codicil where the Turks will not go too much further and they'll take it easy. And that won't be public. Erdogan doesn't want to be public for face-saving reasons. The Turkish economy is a mess, Rick. 14% unemployment per the IMF. It's going to contract by 2.5% this year. So American sanctions are a very real lever and a very real threat hanging over Erdogan that the president has.
That's a great point. John Jordan, as usual, thank you, my friend, for joining us and sharing some of your insight with us on this story. Tonight, we continue our focus on Ecuador, where things are getting so heated in the capital of Quito that the president literally moved his government out of town to the coastal city of Guayaquil after reports that angry residents stormed the General Assembly building there. Tonight, we follow up with our man in Ecuador. Here now is RT correspondent Nick Sanchez O'Donovan.
Ecuador remains under state of emergency after days of protests following President Lenin Moreno's decision to scrap fuel subsidies. On Monday, those protests turned into riots as students and other groups violently clashed with police forces. Afterwards, thousands of indigenous people came here to Quito, and violence continued throughout the night as protesters surrounded the presidential palace. The tension was so high that the president decided to move the administrative capital from here, from Quito, to Guayaquil, Ecuador's second largest city.
Vamos a estar hasta las últimas consecuencias.
But what's behind these protests? Well, at the centre of it all is an economic reform package that the government has implemented under a $4.2 billion financing deal signed with the IMF. Ecuador wants to use this money to cope with a large foreign debt and fiscal deficit. Parts of the package include the scrapping of subsidies to gasoline and diesel that have been in place for 4 decades. Under the new scenario, fuel prices have risen sharply. To give us an idea, diesel went up from $1 per gallon to $2.30, and gas went up from $1.85 to $2.39. But the government has said that these prices going up are just due to speculation. But the truth is that we have already seen prices go up in public transport. For instance, a single bus ticket in the Quito metro area went from 25 cents to 35 cents overnight. The rise in fuel prices has triggered a domino effect, and other basic goods are going up in price too, creating uncertainty among the people. But many here say that fuel prices are just the tip of the iceberg, and they disagree with the neoliberal agenda put in place by Lenin Moreno.
Lenin Moreno's neoliberal policies, which followed the dictates of the International Monetary Fund with the elimination of subsidies, affects university students because we're the children of workers and peasants. To increase the already high costs of living and to keep wages as low as they are means that many students can't continue their studies.
That the government leave, that Lenin Moreno leave. We don't want him as president because it has a really negative effect on us.
Now the government is also implementing measures such as tax cuts to balance the higher cost of fuels and incentivize economic growth. But many here say it's too little, too late. Meanwhile, here in Quito, the city prepares for more days of violence. Schools are closed, some businesses have decided to close down too, and public transport is down to a minimum. But for some, protesters here have gone too far and are just using this political unrest as an excuse for violence and vandalism. For others, this is a vital fight for the country's future. Nicholas O'Donovan for the News with Rick Sanchez.
Good stuff. Thank you, Nick. By the way, we are proud to say that we're probably one of the few English-speaking television networks in the United States that keeps its eye and coverages extensively what's going on in Latin America, because we believe there's more to Latin Americans in the United States, who make up 18% of our population, than just immigration stories. That's our news. Thanks so much for being with us. If you've got somebody looking for a newscast that's not like the other guys, tell them we're here. I'm Rick Sanchez. See you again in a half hour when it'll be time again to do news again.